Hi, folks. This is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report. One of the things that we've talked repeatedly about the advantages of different aspects of our tackle, of why, and last week in particular, I talked about the differences in lines and how they can affect your fishing and how they can affect you in your patience and your frustration, especially when you get tangled. Another thing that I want to cover is the action of the rod. And this can be far more important than you might think and that I might have thought. But if we're using braid, and again, I don't want to spend every week on lines, but if you're using braid, it doesn't stretch. It's far more sensitive. And because it doesn't stretch, when you hook a fish, you feel the fish, but it's easier to set the hook. But depending on the action of the rod you're using, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. And if you're using something like a hard plastic plug, a crankbait, or if you're using a spinner bait or something like this that's moving, you're already moving. It's not like you're casting a worm out there, a live one or a plastic one, letting it sit on the bottom and barely moving. When you got to set the hook, you got to have something that doesn't give and that will set it. But if you're using a rod that is too stiff, if it's too heavy in action, if that rod tip doesn't bend, and I really want you to think about this, if that rod tip doesn't bend, that when you hook a fish, a lot of times, and you're using braid, and that lure's already moving, you actually are putting too much force on the hook and on the fish at that moment, and the rod will actually pull the hook out of the fish very easily. And that's why a lot of times you'll lose fish, you'll hook them for a second and lose them because the rod is too stiff and it pulled the hook out. If you've got a more flexible tip, it gives. Just like if you use a monofilament, it gives and allows using lures that are already moving rapidly. It makes them much more effective in holding the fish and allowing you to catch it. And this is really a big deal. And I think of a lot of times when I've hooked a fish, especially using stiff, light graphite rods. I'm not talking light action, but the graphite's very light. And I remember when I first started using graphite rods, I was losing so many fish, and I couldn't understand why. Well, I've always used basically small baits. And so they were small hooks, and they were on like spinners or something. And now I understand, because the graphite was so much stiffer than the fiberglass rods I'd been using, I was pulling the hook out and not realizing it because I wasn't setting the hook any differently. So I think it's something to really keep in mind, and I'm going to change. I'm going to change this year. When I'm fishing pike and bass, I'm going to use a lighter tip rod because in most cases, I'm not fishing at that fast speed like a lot of people do. I think it's really important. Anyway, I wanted to pass on this tip because it might help some of you that wonder why so many fish get away, because I don't care who we are. We aren't going to catch all of them. We're going to lose some of them. And sometimes that one we lose, and not sometimes, almost always, the fish that we lose becomes the biggest fish that we've ever had on. I lost the big one today. If that one hadn't got off, I'd have won the tournament, or I'd have pictures of this. That's just the way fish stories are made. They're creations of our mind. And the one we lose is always the biggest one of all. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report.